They had been trained to die, told that surrender was worse than death, warned that if captured, American soldiers would torture them, dismember them, turn them into trophies. So when they woke up on that first morning in a Wisconsin prisoner of war camp and saw what was on their breakfast tray, something inside them broke, not from cruelty, from kindness. A thick hamburger on a soft white bun, golden French fries, an ice-cold bottle of Coca-Cola beading with condensation. More food in one meal than they'd seen in weeks, more than some of their families back home had seen in months. And then they wept. By the end of this story, you'll understand why American hamburgers and Coca-Cola became more powerful weapons than any bomb. Why thousands of Japanese soldiers who had been willing to die for their emperor ended up questioning everything they'd been told, and why the simple act of feeding prisoners with dignity might have been one of the most effective psychological operations of World War II. Because this isn't just about food, it's about the moment when propaganda meets reality and shatters completely. The year was 1942. Japan was winning the Pacific War. Their soldiers had been taught since childhood that they were part of a divine race destined to rule Asia. The emperor was a living god. Surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Death in battle was not just honorable but expected, demanded, sacred. The Japanese military had drilled this into every soldier's mind. If you are captured, you have broken all ties with Japan. Your family will be shamed, your name will be erased. You will be considered dead regardless. Better to pull the pin on a grenade and take enemies with you. Better to charge into machine gun fire. Better anything than the dishonor of raising your hands in surrender. But here's what made it even more terrifying for Japanese soldiers. They had been told exactly what Americans would do to prisoners. The propaganda was specific, detailed, designed to horrify. American soldiers were portrayed as demons with two faces, barbarians, savages who would torture Japanese prisoners, cut off their fingers, use their skulls as ashtrays, their bones as letter openers. And you know what? Some of that propaganda was based on actual incidents. There were documented cases of American soldiers taking Japanese body parts as trophies. Photos of these atrocities had circulated. So when Japanese soldiers heard the warnings, they had reason to believe them. This meant that Japanese soldiers fought with a desperation that shocked American troops. They would hide in caves until they starved, launch suicide charges against hopeless odds, detonate grenades while wounded, anything to avoid capture. In the early years of the Pacific War, the ratio of Japanese prisoners to Japanese dead was 1 to 100. 1 prisoner for every 100 dead. Think about that. But accidents happen in war. A soldier gets knocked unconscious by a blast, wounded so badly he can't fight or flee, cut off from his unit with no ammunition, and sometimes, just sometimes, they got captured alive. When they woke up in American hands, they expected death. Actually, they wanted death. Many tried to provoke their captors into ending them quickly. But what happened instead would change everything. Let me take you to Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. September 1943. This camp would eventually house more Japanese prisoners than any other facility in the continental United States. At its peak, 2,700 Japanese prisoners of war behind barbed wire in the middle of America's heartland. Picture this. You're a Japanese soldier. Maybe you were on a sinking ship and the Americans pulled you from the water before you could drown yourself. Maybe you were buried in a collapsed bunker and dug out unconscious. However it happened, you failed in the one duty that mattered most. You didn't die. Now you're in a truck, blindfolded, waiting for the inevitable. But instead of a bullet, you get processed, photographed, given clean clothes, taken to a barracks, and then something happens that makes no sense, according to everything you know about the world. Someone hands you a tray of food. The hamburger sits there, still warm. The bun is impossibly white and soft, nothing like the rice balls you'd been eating, and those had run out months ago anyway. The meat patty is thick, seasoned, cooked properly. There are fried potatoes on the side, crispy and salted. A bottle of Coca-Cola, so cold it hurts your hand to hold it. In that bottle alone, there's more sugar than most Japanese civilians had seen in weeks. You stare at it. You've been eating half-rotten fish and whatever you could scavenge. Your ribs are showing. You've watched your friends die from malnutrition and disease, and now your enemy, the demons you were told about, have handed you more food than you've seen in months. Here's the part that will give you chills. Many Japanese prisoners believed this was a trick. They thought the food was poisoned, that this was the torture beginning, a cruel joke before the real horrors started. Some refused to eat. They'd rather starve than give their captors the satisfaction of whatever came next. But days passed. The food kept coming. 3 meals a day. Nobody got sick from it. Nobody died. And slowly, impossibly, Japanese prisoners began to realize something that shattered their entire understanding of the world. The Americans were actually following the Geneva Convention. Now here's where the story gets even more powerful. While Japanese prisoners in American camps were eating hamburgers and playing baseball and receiving medical care, their fellow Japanese soldiers were doing something completely different to American prisoners. And the contrast is almost unbearable. In Japanese POW camps across the Pacific, American and Allied prisoners were dying at a rate of 40%. 40%. Compare that to just 1% of Americans in German camps. In the Philippines, the Bataan Death March forced 70,000 prisoners to walk 100 kilometers in the burning sun with almost no food or water. Thousands died. Prisoners were beaten with bamboo sticks, used as slave labor, forced to work in mines until they collapsed, fed so little that grown men weighed under 100 pounds. One American prisoner recalled being weighed weekly by Japanese guards. Not out of concern. They were keeping scientific records of exactly how little food they needed to keep prisoners alive and working. The minimum caloric intake before complete collapse. Literally conducting starvation experiments. So try to imagine the psychological shock for Japanese prisoners when they realized their treatment in America was not torture, but its opposite. When they learned that their captors were spending 51 cents per day per prisoner on food. When they got access to the camp store where they could buy candy bars, cigarettes, model kits, and Coca-Cola with the money they earned from work details. Yes, they were paid for their work. 80 cents per day for enlisted men. The Japanese military had taught them they'd be worked to death. Instead, according to the Geneva Convention, they couldn't work more than 12 hours and had to be compensated. At Camp McCoy, Japanese prisoners planted traditional gardens, built Buddhist shrines, created artificial flowers from colored paper and wire. They were taken to the local theater once a week for movies. They had a tennis court, a library, 350-seat theater, recreational leagues. When Red Cross packages arrived, one prisoner described the change in camp morale like children receiving new toys at Christmas. These men had been prepared to die for their emperor. Now they were playing softball in Wisconsin and drinking Coca-Cola. But what happened next is the real story. The part that military intelligence hadn't fully anticipated. Because when Japanese prisoners realized they weren't going to be tortured or executed, when they saw that everything their government had told them was a lie, something broke inside them. Or maybe something awoke. They started talking, not just answering questions, volunteering information. Japanese prisoners of war became some of the most cooperative intelligence sources of the entire war. They provided detailed information about troop movements, fortifications, battle plans. Why? Because they believed that by surrendering, they had already broken all ties with Japan. They were dead to their families, their names erased. So why protect a nation that had abandoned them? American interrogators found that if they exaggerated what they already knew and asked prisoners to confirm details, Japanese prisoners of war would correct them and provide even more information. They weren't resisting. They were trying to be helpful, grateful even for the food and medical care they'd received. Think about the psychology of this. You spend your whole life being told that you are part of a superior race serving a divine emperor in a sacred mission, that your enemies are subhuman barbarians, that death is preferable to the dishonor of capture. And then you get captured, and your enemies treat you with more humanity than your own military showed its soldiers. Everything you believed is revealed as a lie, not through torture or interrogation techniques, through hamburgers, through medical care, through being treated like a human being instead of an animal. By 1943, the Allied governments knew exactly how badly their prisoners were being treated in Japanese camps. The death rates, the torture, the slave labor, the starvation. So they made a calculated decision. They would show the Japanese government how well Allied forces were treating Japanese prisoners. Photographs were taken. Reports were sent through neutral Swiss intermediaries. Look, see how we feed them. See the medical facilities. See them playing sports. We're following the Geneva Convention. Perhaps you might do the same. The Japanese government refused to even acknowledge the reports. Why? Because officially, no Japanese soldier had surrendered. The Japanese government maintained this fiction throughout the entire war. They would not recognize the existence of prisoners because that would mean admitting that Japanese soldiers had chosen surrender over death. The propaganda couldn't allow for that possibility. This created a tragic irony. Japanese prisoners in American camps sometimes wanted to write letters home, to tell their families they were alive, that they were being treated well. But most didn't send the letters. It was better to let their families believe they had died honorably in battle than know the truth. The shame would be unbearable. When Red Cross packages began arriving in late 1944, the change in camp morale was dramatic. One prisoner's diary entry described men who had been broken derelicts transformed into something resembling their old selves. Not because of military discipline or propaganda, but because someone had sent them chocolate and cigarettes and soap. Because someone, somewhere, thought they deserved basic human dignity. Not all Japanese prisoners adjusted easily. At Camp McCoy in May 1944, there were confrontations between prisoners and guards. Nothing that resulted in fatalities, but tensions existed. Many prisoners remained loyal to the emperor. They refused to work, stayed antagonistic. The shame of capture was too deep, the psychological weight of dishonor too heavy. But by the war's end, something remarkable happened. When Japanese officers and NCOs were transferred out of Camp McCoy in August 1945, they gave exit interviews, and they said they were pleased with how the camp had been run. They attributed the camp's success to the involvement of the commandant, Lieutenant Colonel Horace Rogers. They said their treatment had been outstanding. These were the same men who had been told that Americans were demons, who had believed they would be tortured and murdered, and now they were thanking their captors. 74%. That's the percentage of Japanese prisoners who left American camps with an appreciation for democracy and a friendly attitude toward their captors. An exit poll of over 22,000 prisoners showed this transformation. The United States had done what seemed impossible. They had turned enemy soldiers into people who respected their captors by simply treating them humanely. But here's the shadow over this story. The contradiction that demands acknowledgement. While Japanese soldiers in American camps were eating hamburgers and drinking Coca-Cola, Japanese Americans, American citizens, were being held in internment camps on U.S. soil. Families who had done nothing wrong. Citizens whose only crime was their ancestry, held behind barbed wire, stripped of their property, their rights suspended. At the same time, the United States was demonstrating the moral superiority of treating enemy soldiers with dignity. It was simultaneously violating the rights of its own citizens based on race. The very propaganda that portrayed Japanese as inferior, as the other, as a threat, this same propaganda enabled both the humane treatment of prisoners of war to prove American values and the inhumane treatment of Japanese American citizens, who faced no due process. This paradox is crucial to understanding the story. The United States could be remarkably humane and profoundly unjust at the same time, could follow the Geneva Convention for enemy soldiers while ignoring constitutional rights for its own citizens. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola were real, the kindness was real, and so was the racism. After the war ended, Japanese prisoners were slowly repatriated. The United States and Britain held thousands until 1946 and 1947. The Soviet Union kept hundreds of thousands in Siberian labor camps until the early 1950s. Some didn't return until the Soviet Union collapsed in the 1990s. But the ones who spent the war in American camps came home with stories that seemed like fantasy to Japanese civilians. Stories of abundance while Japan had starved. Stories of kindness from the enemy while their own government had lied. Stories of hamburgers and Coca-Cola when rice had been rationed to nothing. Some former prisoners remembered their time in American camps with something that seems impossible: fondness. Not because imprisonment was pleasant, not because they forgot they were behind barbed wire, but because they had been treated as human beings, because in the midst of the most brutal war the Pacific had ever seen, someone had handed them a hamburger and said, "Here, you must be hungry." You see, what happened in those camps wasn't just about following rules or international law. It was about what happens when you refuse to dehumanize your enemy, even when your enemy has dehumanized theirs. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola became symbols of something larger, proof that American propaganda about democracy and individual dignity wasn't completely hollow, that there was something real underneath the rhetoric, and that created cognitive dissonance that Japanese prisoners couldn't resolve. If Americans were barbaric demons, why were they being fed so well? If surrender meant dishonor and death, why were they still alive and healthy? If Japan's cause was divinely righteous, why had their government lied about everything? These questions haunted prisoners for the rest of their lives. The simple act of showing kindness to the enemy became more effective at undermining Japanese military ideology than any battlefield victory could have been. Not because it changed the war's outcome. By the time most Japanese soldiers were captured, Japan was already losing. But because it planted seeds of doubt that grew into something more profound. A recognition that maybe, just maybe, everything they'd been told was wrong. The lesson here isn't simple. It's not that kindness always wins or that treating enemies well guarantees peace. The world is more complicated than that. The same nation that fed Japanese prisoners hamburgers was also preparing to drop atomic bombs on Japanese cities. The same government that followed Geneva Convention rules was interning Japanese American citizens without trial. But what the story of Japanese prisoners of war and American hamburgers teaches us is this. When you meet hatred with humanity, when you respond to cruelty with basic decency, when you choose to see the person behind the uniform, even when they don't see you the same way, you create the possibility for something different. Not redemption, necessarily. Not absolution, but recognition. Recognition that we are all capable of being convinced of lies, that propaganda works on everyone, that the soldier across from you was probably told the same things about you that you were told about them, that the only way to break the cycle is for someone to have the courage to say, "I will not become what I'm fighting against." The hamburgers mattered because they were unexpected. The Coca-Cola mattered because it was unnecessary. The kindness mattered because it revealed that everything the prisoners had believed about their enemy was propaganda. And that realization, multiplied across thousands of prisoners, created ripples that extended far beyond the barbed wire. In September 1945, one Japanese prisoner wrote in his diary about the day the war ended. He described the confusion, the uncertainty about what would happen next. But then he wrote something that summarizes everything. He said that, during his time at Camp McCoy, he had been treated with kindness he didn't deserve and didn't understand. That the Americans had shown him that the stories he'd been told were lies. That they had given him food when he was starving, and medicine when he was sick, and dignity when he felt he had none left. And that hamburger, he wrote, was the best meal he ever ate. Not because it was delicious, though it was. Not because he was hungry, though he was. But because it was the moment when he realized that maybe everything he'd been taught about the world was wrong. That maybe there was another way to be human. That maybe the enemy wasn't who he thought they were. And maybe, just maybe, neither was he. Think about that the next time you bite into a hamburger. Think about the power of simple kindness. Think about what it means to treat someone with dignity even when they're your enemy. Think about how a cold Coca-Cola in the middle of Wisconsin changed the way thousands of men understood their entire lives. Because in the end, this story isn't really about World War II. It's about what happens when propaganda meets reality, when hatred encounters humanity, when cruelty is answered with compassion. The hamburgers and Coca-Cola didn't win the war, but they might have planted seeds that made the peace possible. They showed that even in the darkest moments, even when nations are trying to destroy each other, individual people can still choose humanity, can still see past the uniform to the person underneath, can still say, "You are my enemy, but you are also hungry, and I have food." That choice matters. It always has. It always will. And sometimes, that choice looks like a hamburger and a Coca-Cola on a tray in a Wisconsin prisoner of war camp in 1943, handed to a man who expected to die and instead learned to hope.